Hello friends, my name's Roisin, and if you want to read historical fiction but you're not sure where to start, then you've come to the right place. Hello friends, and welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. Today's video is going to be some historical fiction recommendations, but this is going to be a historical fiction for beginners. If you've never read historical fiction before, or it's been a while since you did and you're not sure what to dip your toe into, I'm going to give you some recommendations. Historical fiction, you'd think, would be a genre that would be very easy to define. It's any piece of fiction set in the past, surely. But no, there are arguments about what counts as historical fiction and what doesn't. I think mostly because some critics don't want to feel old when the 70s counts as historical fiction. So some people say it has to be set more than 70 years before the book was published. Some say 50 years, some say 20 years before the writer was born. So there are all sorts of various different arguments about what counts as historical fiction. Then there is also the fact that historical fiction sometimes bleeds into other genres, such as fabulist or magical realist historical fiction, which is set in the past but has elements of fantasy in it, or romantic historical fiction, which is very clearly a romance set in the Middle Ages. So of course boundaries are not always clear, but I'm not here today to try and define historical fiction. I'm just going to give you some recommendations. I love reading books set in the past. It is a way to explore different worlds, different ideas, learn things I didn't know about the past, and draw allegories for our present day. I'm only going to recommend books I've loved and books I have read, but I know there are definitely many more out there, so see this more as a jumping off point. And I hope you will learn to love historical fiction as much as I do. And if you do already love historical fiction, then maybe some of these genre boundaries will push you to explore the other genre. If you've loved some of these books, maybe you will enjoy sci-fi or YA. We'll have to have a look. So first, I thought I would recommend you some historical fiction if you like crime or thrillers. Crime and thrillers is, again, a really broad genre. You might love a gory murder or a psychological thriller or a cozy mystery. So I'm going to try and recommend some based in different limits of this range. First one I'm going to recommend is The Unexpected Return of Josephine Fox by Claire Gadridge. This is a cozy mystery, although it is a bit on the darker end of cozy mystery, set during the Second World War, so it clearly spans both of these genres. It tells the story of a woman who returns to the town where she grows up, only to discover there has been a murder of a girl whose body was placed in a bomb site so that people would think that she had died because of the Blitz. It is your standard cozy mystery with a woman teaming up with a detective to try and work out what has gone on, and it delves into the social mores of small town life in Britain and in the 1940s, and what could have happened to a young girl like this. It definitely has a darker edge than a lot of cozy mysteries. I think the cover looks very cozy, and the setting definitely is too, because it recalls that Agatha Christie small town vibes, but this one does delve a bit darker. I think the writing is good and the mystery is pacey, so if that's your sort of thing, I think you would enjoy this one. If you're into something a bit more slow paced, slow moving, but with a psychological bent and a sense of foreboding, I wouldn't say that this one counts as an actual thriller, but it definitely has vibes that I think you would like. So if you like your thrillers with a sense of impending doom, something bad is going to happen, machinations that your character accidentally slips into, then I think you would like The Mercies by Kiran, Millwood, Hargrave. This is set on an island off the coast of Norway in the 17th century, and it follows a community where most of the men have died due to a storm while they were out fishing, and the women have to learn to fend for themselves. It is set during the period of the witch hunts, and a man is sent to the island to see what these women are getting up to. Whilst it talks about female relationships and it has that small town vibes, if you like things like Shetland, I think that this would be one that you would enjoy in terms of a historical fiction. And whilst the authorities are going to get someone, it's not necessarily what you want to happen in this book. Now, if you like romance, then you can of course read historical romance. Historical romance is definitely harder on the romance and less on the historical, because whilst it's set in a historical time period, I don't think anyone really cares about accuracy. It's just more that there were more constraints on what you could get up to in those times, and I guess that's what makes it more intriguing for a romance setting. In terms of historical romance, I like Tessa Dare. But if you like a romance and you want to try some historical fiction that has romantic overtones but is not quite so explicit as your standard romance, then I would suggest Chocolat by Joanne Harris, which tells the story of a woman and her daughter who move into this small town in France around just after the Second World War and set up a chocolate shop during Lent. It is a lot about her getting on the wrong side of the Catholic authorities and their differences in the communities as this woman and her daughter are a part of a travelling community. But there is also a romance at the heart of this book that I think would really suit people who enjoy a romance. Another one I would recommend if you like your classic romances like Jane Austen is The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. If you've watched my videos before, you may know that this is not my personal favourite, but a lot of people have really loved it. And it is set in that Regency period, which is very popular among romance writers and is based on the life of Mary Bennet, the middle sister from Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. So if you want to dive into that world, it explores it from a much less social comedy of manners way, and a much more individualistic focus on one character and her personal exploration and growth. And there is also a romance for the more wallflower sister of the Bennets, which I think is another common theme from romance. Science fiction was one that I found a little tricky. I know there are actually quite a big subset of science fiction books set in historical periods, but they're not something that I have tried out, as I'm not a big science fiction reader myself. What I have enjoyed though is historical fiction that centres around science, historical science, and so for that I would recommend The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry, which tells the story of a woman who moves to a small Essex town because she hears that there is a giant serpent terrorising the coast. This is at the time of the discoveries of fossils and the expansion in what people in Victorian times thought possible. They thought there might be living fossils that they could discover. And so it is a bit about that, about her hunting for fossils and about mass hysteria and how that affects a small town. But also one of the characters is a heart surgeon, and we go a lot into his surgery practice and his attempt to do the first ever heart transplant. So there is definitely a very science heavy aspect in this. It is also about the antagonism between science and faith. And so I think that science is such a big part of this novel that if that is the part of science fiction that intrigues you, I think that this would work. Another one that I think would work for someone who is more into the adventure side of science fiction and science that is a lot more fictitious than actually historical science would be The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley. This tells the story of a watchmaker who uses the science of ether and how things can move through the ether, which was a Victorian theory of particle movement, which has obviously been very debunked, but in this world it does work. There's a lot of things that work by clockwork bombs and things like that, so it's definitely kind of a steampunk science fiction action adventure thing, and I think that if you like science fiction it might be right up your street. One that I did find a bit more easy, because it is something that I really enjoy, is when historical fiction is melded with fantasy. So for all you fantasy readers out there, I would recommend The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. This is set in a medieval Russia, and it tells the story of a girl whose father remarries to this religious person, and the girl and her new stepmother can both see the spirits or the gods of the old Russian religion, but the stepmother is very, very Christian and she thinks they are demons. With the new vicar who has come to that town, they are trying to get rid of the old religion, old religious practices, but this leaves the town vulnerable to Frost, the kind of big bad of the old Russian religion, and so there is kind of an adventure and magic that ensues in a very historical setting. Another historical fiction that has very, very slight fantasy overtones, so taking you more directly into the historical fiction, would be The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gower. This is set in the 18th century in London, and it is about a courtesan and a merchant. The courtesan has really recently lost her sugar daddy and is down on her luck and being pursued by her old brothel madam, and the merchant has been brought back a curiosity from the Far East, a mermaid, which he puts on display. But then he sends his ship out to find another mermaid, and that mermaid is quite different from the sort of monkey sewn onto a dolphin skeleton that he had been brought originally. It is definitely very much about manners and about the 18th century. It is a novel where you can feel the 18th century around you the whole time in the way that of the language and the description, but not in a very clean romance novel kind of 18th century. This is a dirty smallpox-laden 18th century, and I definitely think that it feels really visceral and real, and I love that about it. But it still has that kind of magical overtones and fantasy as an allegory for the human condition that I think is what a lot of people love about fantasy. If what you really like about fantasy is exploring a world that you have not explored and a wide cast of characters with lots of different perspectives, lots of different cultures coming together, then I would recommend The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. A 900-page book, I believe, which I know will not be intimidating for you fantasy readers out there, set in New Zealand in the 19th century during the Gold Rush, about a mix of European colonists from the UK, from Nordic countries, and also a Maori man, and also the Chinese people who've been drawn to the Gold Rush as well. There is a clash between newcomers to the Gold Rush and people who have colonised New Zealand for a long time, and it is the perspective of 12 different men when a mysterious disappearance of a man, a discovery of a fortune, and a woman who is found delirious and thought to have attempted suicide. And then there is also a murder. So there is a big mystery at the heart of this that we are trying to unfold, but really it is about all of these different characters and a culture shock, which I think is something that is often explored in fantasy. This time it is with a historical bent. Now, for those of you out there who love to read non-fiction, and particularly historical or political non-fiction, I think historical fiction can of course be very clearly up your alley. If you like to read about history or about other people's lives or about politics from the past, then you can easily transfer that into a well-written piece of historical fiction that can help you to learn more and even make the facts stickier in your mind because they are attached to a story. Of course, fiction often blurs the boundaries between what is real and what didn't happen, so you do need to keep on top of that when you're reading it. But if you like political non-fiction, then I think you would like Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jerdowski. This is set in Poland in 1979-1980, about two boys who meet at an agricultural camp where university students are sent to spend a term working the land in order to graduate. These two boys meet and fall in love, and then it is about their going back to Warsaw and their experience as one of them gets more into the party and one of them gets more into the resistance during the fall of the Soviet Union, which is a really interesting period to explore politically, and this is a very interesting perspective and also very beautifully written. I would also recommend a book set in a similar time period but half a world away, and that is A Brief History of 7 Killings by Marlon James. Another big chunky book, but if you like to read a lot of political and historical non-fiction, I don't think that will intimidate you at all. This tells the story of Jamaica during the 1970s and 80s and of Jamaican immigrants to America in the 80s and 90s. It is all about the infiltration of the CIA in the Jamaican political system, of gang warfare in Jamaica, and how that was perpetuated by the CIA and by the drug war of the time. So there is a lot of politics and history involved in here, but it's told from multiple different perspectives, majority of them Jamaican, one of them a dead English journalist, his ghost's perspective, and then also members of the CIA, people who were hired from Argentina to come and work in, who had worked with the CIA in Argentina, and it's kind of an exploration of corruption and of colonialist involvement in post-colonial countries, which is really, really interesting if you're interested in that period of history. And it also explores socio-historical themes of gender and sexuality during this time period in this setting of Jamaica, Florida, and New York. And then the other one that I would recommend, which I think if you're into politics and history, I think you will definitely have heard of, if not already read, is The Crucible by Arthur Miller. So this is a classic play that is set during the witch hunts in Salem, but is an allegory for McCarthyism during the 1950s. So again, I guess it's a similar perspective. I'm talking a lot about the West versus socialism and communism in this section, but I think that that's a period of history that a lot of people who are into history and politics are interested in, and Arthur Miller uses the mass hysteria of the witch hunts to talk about the mass hysteria of the hunts for communists in the government and in Hollywood. I think it's one that I want to reread because I read it at school, and so I'd be interested to see what I think about the gender differences between those two time periods now, but it's definitely a very powerful play and I really enjoyed it, so I would recommend that. Changing tack now, if you are into YA or middle grade, then there is a lot of YA and middle grade that is historical fiction itself, which I think would be an easy route in because it still has that same theme, the same style of writing as YA. So the ones I would recommend are quite famous. So The Book Thief by Markus Zusak, which is set in Germany during the Nazi period and is about a girl called Liesel who starts to steal books and who is separated from her mother and adopted by this family, and it's kind of her relationship with that family when they decide to hide a Jewish person in their basement, and so she's learning to read, stealing books, and also there's a Jewish person, and also there's bombings and things, very World War II, but it's all told from the perspective of death. And I think it's a really interesting book, probably the first kind of more experimental book that I read because I read it as a young teenager, but one that I believe still holds up. Another one that I read as a child that I think still stands up is Warhorse by Michael Morpurgo, which tells the story of a boy and his horse during the First World War, and it's kind of a novel about the senselessness of war and the cruelty to humans and animals that was enacted during the First World War. It's about resilience and fighting to get back to your home in a way, and it is also really beautiful, really moving, really powerful book that I think that if you like middle grade is a good entry into historical middle grade. And then finally, one that's maybe slightly less well known is A Gathering Light or A Northern Light by Jennifer Donnelly. It was published differently in the UK and North America. And this tells the story of Mattie Gorky, who is a young woman who lives in the Adirondack Mountains in northern New York State around the turn of the 19th, 20th century. She wants to be a teacher, she wants to go to university, she wants to get out of the small town in which she lives, but she feels trapped there because her father is an alcoholic and she kind of has to take over the looking after of her children and the running of their farm. And it's split between two timelines, her when she is younger growing up and dealing with the confines of her society and the confines of her small town life that she wants to break out of, and then her when she's older and a girl has been found dead, potentially murdered outside the hotel where she works, and she holds a bundle of her letters and discovers how the constrictions of her life suffocated and ended in the murder of this woman, and so we go back and forth between those two timelines. It is a beautiful, slow-moving, coming-of-age story, and I think one that works well for people who want to move from YA into more adult historical fiction because it moves across that coming-of-age part of someone's life. I'm not a huge horror reader, but if you love horror, especially gothic horror, I would recommend The Confessions of Franny Langton by Sarah Collins, which is a gothic book set in the 1820s, 1830s, about a enslaved woman in Jamaica who is brought to Britain and given as a gift to this man. The man who had enslaved her and the man who she has been gifted to has been are both involved in race science, and they have done some brutal, terrible things. We know from the outset that Franny Langton has been accused of the murder of the man to whom the race scientist and his wife, and we kind of it is told from her perspective, exploring those things. It is a very, very dark novel with some gruesome things in it, which I guess if you're a horror reader you'll be happy to read that, and it has very strong gothic overtones, so if you like to read classic horror I feel like this would be right up your street. All my literary fiction pals, I do read literary fiction a lot, so I think that I can speak to you. Wolfhall, obviously, I'm not going to go on about it, but I've got a whole review up here if you want to go and check that out. I talk about it all the bloody time, but it's the best book ever. Also, if you are a literary fiction fan, I think The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje is an incredibly beautiful book that is set during the Second World War in this villa in Italy that tells the story of these people and how they got there. There is a woman who is a Canadian nurse who is looking after this English patient, a man who is completely burned from head to toe and speaks with an English accent. That's why they called him the English patient. And a sapper who is camping in the garden trying to defuse a bomb, and he is a Sikh man from India. And it explores how they all got to this place in kind of really dreamlike flashbacks, and also their time here. It's quite one of those books without punctuation, without speech marks, and without clear delineation of when we're going back in time and whose time period we're going back into, which is something I love, because I feel like it's really flowing and beautiful and shows you how they all interweave. It's definitely done with great purpose, but I know that some people hate that sort of thing. But if you read literary fiction, I feel like you'll be on my wavelength and be up for that, and also you won't mind that their penis is described as a seahorse, because when I read negative reviews of this book, that line really stuck with people. But It's a brilliant book and I really, really recommend it. One that is probably one of the most experimental novels that I have ever read, Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, is incredible. It tells the story of what happened when Lincoln's son died on the night he was having a party. Part of this party and the death and the experience of grief that Lincoln went through is told through sections of historical sources, of people's diaries and letters that they had written. Some of these are real historical sources of this real historical event and some are made up, but all of the parts of that night are told from all these different voices of the time, which is really interesting. Then we go into the Bardo, which also tells things from different perspectives, but is all entirely fictional. The Bardo is a Tibetan Buddhist idea of what happens after you die, and so there are all these different people from about a century's worth of American history telling the story of how they died. There is a mass grave full of enslaved people, and there is discussion about that, and there is also, there's a lot about the brutality of American history, 18th and 19th centuries, and it is really, really beautiful and moving, and I love the cacophony of voices. The audiobook is also great if that is something that you enjoy. If you enjoy contemporary women's fiction, and that is something that you love to read, there is a lot of historical fiction that is contemporary women's fiction. In fact, I did a reading vlog reading basically that. But the ones that I would recommend are Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, which is set on Guernsey during and after the Second World War, and it is told entirely epistolarily. It's told in letters between multiple different people, so you get lots of different voices, which is really beautiful. It talks a lot about the occupation of Guernsey by the Nazis, which is not something I knew very much about before I read this novel, and the relationships between everyone is very moving, and it has a romance and a family at the heart of it, which I think is really well done. I would also recommend you The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue, which is set during the 1918 flu epidemic in Dublin in a maternity ward, where everyone in the ward is a pregnant woman who has the flu, and the ward is completely understaffed because the flu is completely taking out this hospital, and so there are 3 women who are running this maternity ward. There is the female doctor who was part of the 1916 uprising, a woman who is Nurse Power, who's kind of the nurse who's overseeing most of it and the person from whose perspective we see the story, and Birdie, this kind of skivvy who is brought in never having done a day's work in a hospital in her life. And it is a really powerful, moving story of women's history in Ireland and the history of maternal health in Ireland, which is frankly shocking. Also, there's talk of the Magdalen laundries and the orphanages run by the church, but it is all done in a really beautiful, moving, well-written way where the relationships between these women are really at the heart of it. Finally, another Irish one is The Island Child by Molly Aitken, which is set on a small island off the west coast of Ireland in the middle of the 20th century, although the people who live on this island live a very traditional life where there is a butting up between the traditional old ways of believing things and the ways of acting and the church, and there is a lot about gender-based violence because of the church, a fear of outsiders and homosexuality, and the trapment of this small island community. But I think if you like women's contemporary fiction that deals with slightly darker themes, I think that this would be one for you. So there you go, a huge pile of recommendations depending on what genres you read. Hopefully I will have covered it here. If there's a genre that you love that I haven't covered, I will leave it in the comments and I will try and get back to you with a few recommendations. I love giving recommendations, so the more specific you are, the better for me. So please remember to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it and to subscribe for more recommendations in the future. I put out new videos every Wednesday, Friday and Sunday, and so I will be back very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye!